Abraham, God has established this covenant with Abraham, and obviously things are going wrong in the household in a really serious way, because, well, he's now had a child by another woman, and the two women are not getting along, and one is beating the other because of her insubordination and contempt, and so she's so desperate she runs out into the desert where she's probably going to die, and God comes along and says anyways to Hagar that her son shall as well be the father of nations. And so that's partly a reflection back on the power of Abraham's covenant, right? Even though things are going terribly wrong locally, let's say, the fact that Abraham has made this overarching agreement with God means that all of these catastrophes are taking place within a bounded space, within the ark, we could say. That's one way of looking at it. And I do think that that's right, because it seems to me that, if everything falls apart around you, there's a couple of things you're going to want. You're going to want someone standing beside you, that's for sure, that you can trust. You're going to want your family around you, and you're going to want them to have your back. And you're going to want to know that you didn't do some goddamn stupid thing to bring all hell down on yourself. And if you're lacking any of those, when that crisis comes, there's a high probability it will flatten you and you won't be able to get up. It does seem to me, you can ask yourself this question: when things collapse around you, how much utility is knowledge of your own moral virtue? It's bad enough to be laid, it's bad to be laid low, but to be laid low and to know that you were at fault for it. And worse, the things that you did that you knew you did that were wrong brought you there, then I think you have nothing to stand on in that situation. And that's also the circumstances under which I think you're more likely, at least, to be abandoned by people around you. So, given that you know that the catastrophe is coming, right, that the tragedy of life will strike you, the question is, well, how do you fortify yourself against that? And obviously, to some degree, you do that by being materially sensible. And these old people in the Old Testament, these ancient people, they weren't blind to the utility of having a good crop and some animals, that's an integral part of their life, to take care of themselves physically. But they're also wise enough to know that there's an element of moral, what would you call it? There's a necessity for moral integration that defends you against the catastrophe of existence even more effectively than anything material. And even more, that the stability of the material things is more dependent on the integrity of your spirit than the integrity of your spirit is dependent on the material things. And I think the evidence for that is actually quite clear. I read a very interesting book a while back called The Wealth and Poverty of Nations, that was written by a Harvard emeritus professor of history. And one of the things that he claimed, and I liked it, I thought it was very smart, was that the only true natural resource is interpersonal trust. If you can set up a society where people trust each other, then it will instantly become rich. And he used the example of Japan, which is a very conscientious society and very rich society, but the Japanese have no natural resources, right? None to speak of. And yet they're rich. And then you have countries like the Soviet Russia and much of South America where there's just natural resources that, they're just like Venezuela. It's just more natural resources than you know what to do with. And the places are absolute catastrophes of cynicism and corruption. And so he attempted to document the relationship between default interpersonal trust among citizens within countries and their productivity and their GDP and their standard of living, and found a very, very tight relationship. So Abraham makes this covenant with God, and he decides that he's going to aim high and live a good life and tell the truth, and that puts this boundary around him. It's like a walled garden. And inside there's all sorts of things that are happening that are complex and difficult, but outside there's a boundary. And the boundary is, well, maybe things won't. It's like God says after the flood, he says, I'll never send a flood again. That's part of the story. And so there's an intimation there that no matter how bad things get, they won't get so bad that they'll be catastrophic. But there's a coda to that, which is that you have to maintain the covenant. And we don't know what that means, because you think it's pretty obvious that if you treat people well, if you really think about it, and you're not being naively optimistic and like, a nice, good person with all the weakness that intimates, if you're being hard-nosed and sensible, you understand that if you treat people, if you trust people, that's an act of courage. If you're not naive, right? If you're naive, it's an act of stupidity, because you might get bit, and you probably will. And if you're naive and you get bit, you will suffer for it. It'll traumatize you. But if you're not naive and you know you can get bit, then you might ask, well, what should you do with people? And the answer is you should trust them. And not because you're naive, and not because they couldn't betray you, and not because you don't know that they could betray you, but because if you hold out your hand in trust, then you're inviting the best part of that person to step forward, and that won't happen unless you take that initial step, and that's courage, not naivety. And so to trust someone once your eyes are open, that's an act of courage, and that opens up the world. You know, and you might say, okay, and so there's this idea in this story that you can withstand a fair bit of the catastrophe of life by establishing the proper covenant and by acting in a trustworthy manner and extending your hand to people properly. And you might say, well, okay, that's sensible. I can understand how that would work. And I can certainly see how the opposite wouldn't work, because, you know, if I have to be absolutely terrified that you're going to betray me at every possible moment, and we're in a negotiation, we're not going to get any work done, man, because I'm going to be figuring out what you're up to all the time, and you're going to be figuring out what I'm up to all the time, and we're just not going to get anywhere. You'll come and say you're going to do something, and I can just simplify you. I can say, you're going to do what you said you do. I don't have to worry about you. And then the same applies to me, and then we can go do something, and that's how we generate wealth.